Hey friends, welcome to my channel and welcome to the second part of this topic, that is spinal cord. In this you will get an idea about the transverse section of the spinal cord as well as what are the features and the nuclear arrangement inside the transverse section of the spinal cord. So let's get started with our topic. If you have not watched the part 1 of this spinal cord topic, so I recommend that you go and watch that video in order to understand this little bit complex topic in a better way. So let's get started with our topic. So I have drawn this transverse section of the spinal cord. In this transverse section of the spinal cord, we need to remember two things. First thing is, in the central area there is gray matter and in the peripheral area there is white matter. So as you can see that in the central area, so this particular area, right, that is a gray matter, and in the peripheral area, so this area, that is the peripheral area, you can see that is the white matter. So in this gray and white, why do we name it as a gray matter and why do we name the peripheral area as a white matter? So the reason behind this is very simple, that whenever we see a neuron, right, we see this kind of a neuron. So in this neuron, three different areas that we usually see. The first thing is the dendrites, which are present over the one end of a neuron. Second thing is the cell body, which is this particular area is known as in cell body. And the third area, that is this particular projection from the cell body, which is single in nature, so that is known as an axon. So three areas are there, and whenever we observe this thing under microscope, so it appears as a gray, and the gray matter which shows the dendrites, let me write it over here, the dendrites, cell body, and the initial portion of the axon. So all these three structures, they appear gray in nature, but as the axon is myelinated, so all the myelinated axons, they appear white in nature. So that is the reason why do we name a gray matter and white matter. So in the gray matter you will always find the dendrites, cell bodies and the axons, and in the white matter you will find myelinated as well as the non-myelinated cells, but the number of non-myelinated cells are very less compared to the myelinated cells. So that is the reason that why do we name it as a gray matter and the white matter. Gray matter, as you know now, that it is center, and the white matter is in the periphery. Now you can see some of the external features and which are very much important to differentiate the right as well as the left halves and to differentiate the columns which are present in the white matter. So as you can see that the anterior, this thing, right, this kind of area which is known as an anterior median fissure. So the anterior median fissure. So whenever we are looking at the transverse section of the spinal cord, so always try to identify this particular area, because this side is the anterior side and you can easily identify by looking at the anterior median fissure. So do remember this thing, that this is the anterior side and which is the first external feature of the transverse section of the spinal cord. Now you can see this thing, a vertical red line. So this vertical red line, which is actually the posterior median fissure, or I can say the septum. This posterior median septum. So second feature of the transverse section of the spinal cord that will help you to identify right and the left sides. So that is the posterior median septum. The posterior median septum, which divides the right half as well as the left half of the spinal cord. So now if someone asks you that define the anterior as well as the posterior sides of the transverse section of the spinal cord. So first you can easily look at the anterior median fissure, which is a gap, as you can see in the lower portion of this diagram. And the second thing is the posterior median septum, which divides the transverse section into the right as well as the left halves. So which is very easy to identify as well as to determine the sides of the spinal cord. Next thing is there are some projections. If I particularly focus on the gray matter of the spinal cord, so there are some of the projections. As you can see that gray matter is, this much area is the gray matter. So in the gray matter you can see a particular projections which are extending towards the posterior side, and similarly two projections which are extending in the anterior side, and a small projections as you can see on the right as well as the left sides. So these projections are known as in horns of the gray matter. So let me write it over here, that the horns which are projecting posteriorly, they are termed as an posterior horn, of gray matter, and the horns which are projecting anteriorly, they are anterior horns of gray matter. And a small projection between the posterior horn, that is posterior horn, and the anterior horn is termed as an lateral horn, that is lateral horn. But lateral horns, we need to know something about it, that lateral horns, those are not present in all the spinal segments. Lateral horns, they are present between the first thoracic and the second lumbar segment. So these many segments, they only contain the lateral horn of the gray matter. Rest all segments, they do not show lateral horn at all. So now we have knowledge of side determination. Next thing is the horns of the gray matter, and in the center, this particular area is known as an spinal canal. Spinal canal, and a fluid which is present inside the spinal canal, which is known as an cerebrospinal fluid. And in the spinal canal, which is filled by the cerebrospinal fluid, so which actually nourishes the spinal cord. Now coming to the white matter of the spinal cord. So in the white matter, first thing that we need to understand that white matter is completely divided into two by the posterior median septum. That this septum divides the left side of the white matter as well as the right side of the white matter. But the white matter is connected anteriorly because there is no septum in the anterior portion of the transverse section of the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, white matter, so as you can see that this particular area is termed as an anterior white column. So let me write it over here, that it is termed as an anterior white column. And typically, if I tell you the location, so it is the area between the one side of the anterior median fissure and on the other side, that is the anterior gray horn. So the area between these two is termed as an anterior white column. And as you can see that there are nerve roots. So the anterior nerve root and the posterior nerve root. So later I will make another video in which I will typically explain the formation of a nerve as well as the nerve roots. So right now, do remember that the anterior horn of the gray matter and the anterior nerve root on the one side, and on the another side there is anterior median fissure, and the area between these two is the anterior white column. Now the area between the anterior gray horn and the posterior gray horn, which is this much area, is termed as an lateral white column. And the last area, that is over the posterior side, so the area between this thing, that is posterior gray horn and the posterior median septum, this much area is termed as an posterior white column. So that is, the three white columns are present. First is anterior white column between the anterior grey horn and the anterior median fissure. Lateral white column between the two horns of the grey matter. Posterior white column between the posterior grey horn and the posterior median septum. So that is only one side which shows the three white columns, that is anterior, lateral and the posterior. Now comes the most important thing, that is the nuclear arrangement inside the transverse section of the spinal cord. So to explain you this in a better way, let me draw a very small diagram over here. That suppose we are talking about the nuclei which are present in the grey matter. So this is the H-shaped grey matter, and in the H-shaped grey matter, now here there are total 4 nuclei which are present only in the posterior grey horn, that is posterior horns. So that is total 4 different nuclei which are present. Let me write it over here. 4 different nuclei which are present only in the posterior grey horn. So in that, the first nucleus which is present on the outermost margin, which is known as an marginal nucleus. Second nucleus which is present just a little bit inside than the marginal nucleus, that is termed as an substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. Third nucleus which is present over here, that is known as a nucleus proprius, or the easy terminology, that is the chief sensory nucleus. And the last nucleus which is present over here, which is known as an dorsal column of Clerk, or I can say the Clerk nucleus. So these 4 nuclei which are only present in the posterior horn cells. Lateral horn, it shows a cluster of neurons, means there is not a single nuclei which is present, but there is a group of nuclei which are present and which is known as an intermediolateral nucleus. So intermediolateral nucleus, there is a typical importance that it gives rise to the postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic chain, that is from the lateral horn of the grey matter. So that is over here, that is lateral grey horn, intermediolateral nucleus. Do remember this thing. And in the anterior and my favorite horn, and it gives 3 nuclei which are present in the anterior horn. That is, first is the alpha nucleus, gamma nucleus and the Rancho cells. So alpha nucleus, so as the alpha nucleus, so which is a multipolar neuron, and the fibers from the alpha nucleus, so which is ending over the extrafusal fibers of the skeletal muscles. From the gamma, that is the gamma motor neuron, so from the gamma neuron, the fibers are ending into the intrafusal fibers of the muscle, and these are the last one, that is the Rancho cell. Rancho cells, they have a typical significance that Rancho cells, they are inhibitory. So they create such kind of synapse that it inhibits the transmission of the impulses in the neuron. So that is the typical function of the Rancho cells. So that was all the information regarding the transverse section of the spinal cord. Now in this video, I have just explained the transverse section of the spinal cord. In my next video, I am going to explain about the tracts of the spinal cord, because these are the nuclei, but the nucleus, that is not the only important structure. There are tracts which carry the impulses inside the spinal cord. And if you have understood the concept of vertebrosegmental dissimilarity, which I have explained in my previous video, it will be very much easy for you to understand the tracts, as well as if you want me to take a topic on the MRI, or I can say the radiology of the transverse section of the spinal cord, do mention in the comment section, and maximum share these videos, and it may help someone to understand the topic in a better way. Do like, share and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so that each and every time I post a new video, you will get a notification to understand something new. So that's all for today's video, and keep learning, keep exploring. Thank you so much for watching the video till the end.